The Grand Chamber was a place that made you feel small in a way nothing else could. Its walls stretched up so high that the ceiling disappeared into pure darkness, like standing at the bottom of an impossibly deep well. But this well was made of crystal that caught light from 1,000 different sources and scattered it in ways that hurt your eyes if you looked too long. The precursors had built this place millions of years ago, back when Earth's ancestors were still figuring out how to climb down from trees. Nobody understood how they'd done it. Nobody even knew what the precursors had looked like. They'd vanished before most of the galaxy's current civilizations had discovered fire. Michael Torres sat near the back of the massive assembly hall, trying not to fidget in his uncomfortable chair. Everything about this place was designed for beings that weren't human. The seat was too wide, the armrest at the wrong height, and the air had a weird metallic taste that made his mouth dry. Around him, representatives from 3,000 different species filled row after row of seating that curved upward in every direction. Some of them were floating balls of gas that glowed different colors. Others looked like walking rocks with crystals growing out of their shoulders. There were beings made of pure energy contained in force fields, creatures that seemed to be mostly tentacles, and things that Michael couldn't even describe because his brain didn't have words for what he was seeing. The human delegation consisted of exactly 3 people. 3. Out of 3,000 species represented here, humanity got 3 chairs near the back where nobody would notice them. Michael supposed they were lucky to be here at all. Earth had only joined the Galactic Council 15 years ago, which meant humanity was basically the new kid at a school where everyone else had been friends for millions of years. Most of the elder species barely acknowledged that humans existed. When they did notice Earth's representatives, it was usually with the kind of polite dismissal you'd give to a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. Michael had spent 6 months preparing for this summit. He'd memorized the names of 400 different species. He'd studied council protocols until he could recite them in his sleep. He'd learned which species considered eye contact respectful and which considered it a threat. He'd practiced the 17 different forms of greeting used in formal council sessions. And despite all that preparation, he still felt like a complete fraud sitting here among beings whose civilizations had mastered space travel before humans had figured out agriculture. Beside him, Ambassador Patricia Reeves maintained the kind of calm expression that came from decades of diplomatic experience. She'd been one of the first humans to make contact with an alien species, back when Earth's governments were still arguing about whether the lights in the sky were real or some kind of elaborate hoax. Nothing seemed to rattle her. Not the casual dismissal from elder species, not the impossible complexity of galactic politics, not even the fact that some of the beings around them could probably crack a planet in half if they wanted to. On Michael's other side, Dr. Robert Hayes was doing what he always did during council sessions, which was frantically taking notes on his tablet while muttering scientific observations under his breath. Robert was a xenoarchaeologist who'd somehow gotten himself attached to the diplomatic corps because he couldn't resist the chance to study alien cultures up close. He was currently documenting the architectural details of the Grand Chamber, measuring angles with his eyes and sketching diagrams that probably made sense to him but looked like random lines to everyone else. The session had been going on for 4 hours now, and Michael was starting to understand why people called council meetings the most boring place in the galaxy. They'd spent 2 hours discussing trade tariff adjustments for mineral exports from the Outer Rim. Another hour debating the proper procedure for filing territorial expansion requests. Half an hour on a dispute about shipping lanes through the Vega cluster. Everything moved at the pace of cold honey, with every species wanting their say, every point debated from 17 different angles, every decision requiring consensus from representatives who thought in completely different ways. Michael tried to pay attention, but his mind kept wandering. He thought about his apartment back on Earth, his cat who was probably mad at him for being gone so long, the basketball game he was missing. He wondered if anyone back home was watching the council broadcast, though he doubted it. Even humanity's biggest space enthusiasts found council sessions tediously boring. Then the doors opened and everything changed. The massive entrance at the far end of the chamber swung inward with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Michael sat up straighter, suddenly alert. Unannounced arrivals didn't happen at council sessions. Everything was scheduled, planned, coordinated months in advance. That was how you kept order when dealing with 3,000 species who all had different ideas about proper protocol. But nobody had scheduled this. The beings who entered moved with military precision. They were insectoid, their bodies covered in dark carapaces that gleamed under the chamber's lights. Each one stood about 7 feet tall on multiple legs that clicked against the crystal floor. Their heads were dominated by compound eyes that reflected light in unsettling ways, and their mandibles clicked together in patterns that Michael's translator earpiece rendered as words. The Vorn hierarchy. Michael recognized them from his briefings, though he'd never seen them in person before. They were known for two things across the galaxy: their military strength and their complete lack of interest in what anyone else thought about their actions. While most species played the game of galactic politics, making alliances and compromises and careful diplomatic moves, the Vorn simply took what they wanted and dared anyone to stop them. Behind the Vorn warriors came something that made Michael's stomach drop. A group of about 20 beings, connected together by glowing energy shackles that hummed with power. They were small, maybe 4 feet tall, with mammalian features and large eyes that darted nervously around the massive chamber. Their fur was matted and dirty, and they moved with the defeated shuffle of people who'd given up hope. Ambassador Reeves' hand tightened on her armrest, her knuckles going white. Dr. Hayes stopped taking notes, his mouth falling open. Around the chamber, other delegates were reacting with surprise, curiosity, or in some cases, complete indifference. The Vorn commander stepped forward, his translated voice echoing through the vast space. "We claim right of petition under Council Charter, Section 47, Paragraph 12. We seek formal recognition of our annexation of the Talvek system and legitimization of our authority over its native inhabitants." Michael stared at the shackled beings. The Talvek. They were captives. Slaves. And the Vorn had brought them here, to the center of galactic government, as if they were presenting evidence in a legal case. The eldest speaker, a being called Luminous Thought who looked like a floating arrangement of crystals, pulsed with soft light. "The petition is acknowledged. Present your case for council consideration." And just like that, as if it were the most normal thing in the universe, they started debating whether slavery was legal. Retry. Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Vorn commander stood in the center of the chamber like he was giving a weather report, calmly explaining why his people had the legal right to enslave an entire planet. His translated voice was smooth and professional, laying out arguments like he was discussing property rights rather than living beings. The Talvek system was pre-warp, the commander explained. The inhabitants hadn't developed faster-than-light travel yet. They were still using primitive rockets and combustion engines. According to galactic law, specifically the Prime Directive that governed contact with developing civilizations, species without warp capability fell outside Council protection. They weren't members. They had no representation. They were, in the legal sense, nobody. Michael's translator earpiece kept feeding him the words, but his brain was stuck on the image of those 20 Talvek huddled together in their energy shackles. One of them was a kid. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old by human standards, with huge eyes that kept darting around the chamber like she was looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Her mother held her close, trying to make herself as small as possible, as if disappearing might protect her daughter from whatever came next. A delegate from the Formian Collective was speaking now, his voice coming through as flat and mechanical. The Vorn petition falls within established legal precedent. Council Law, Section 19, clearly states that pre-warp civilizations exist outside our jurisdiction. We cannot extend protection to species who have not achieved the threshold requirements for galactic citizenship. Michael wanted to stand up and scream that this was insane, but Ambassador Reeves had her hand on his arm, a gentle warning pressure that said stay calm, don't make a scene, this is how things work here. He knew she was right. They were guests here, the newest members, barely tolerated by species who'd been navigating galactic politics since before humans had invented writing. One outburst and Earth's reputation would be destroyed. But knowing that didn't make it easier to watch. A Savanthi representative was speaking now, her serpentine body coiling gracefully as she made her point. We must consider the philosophical implications. If we intervene in the affairs of every pre-warp species, we impose our values on their natural development. The Prime Directive exists to prevent such cultural contamination. These beings may view the Vorn as conquerors today, but in 1,000 years, integration into the hierarchy might be seen as the catalyst for their advancement. Michael felt sick. They were actually debating this. Actually considering whether slavery might be good for the victims in the long run. Dr. Hayes leaned over and whispered, "This is how they've maintained peace for millions of years. Everything goes through debate, through legal channels, through precedent. No species can just act on emotion or intuition. It keeps wars from breaking out. It also lets them ignore suffering when it's convenient," Michael whispered back. The debate continued. Species after species stood to offer their perspective, each one approaching the question from a different angle. Some argued about legal technicalities. Others discussed historical precedent. A few raised concerns about setting bad examples for other aggressive species. But nobody, not a single delegate in that massive chamber, talked about the actual Talvek standing right there in chains. Michael watched the little girl. She'd started crying softly, the kind of quiet crying that kids do when they've learned that making noise gets them in trouble. Her mother whispered something to her, probably trying to comfort her, but the child couldn't stop the tears rolling down her furry cheeks. A Vorn guard turned toward the sound. His mandibles clicked in annoyance. He said something that Michael's translator rendered as, "Silence the offspring." The mother tried. She really did. She pulled her daughter closer, covering her mouth gently, whispering more urgently now. But the kid was scared and exhausted and didn't understand why these giant aliens were keeping her in chains. She whimpered against her mother's hand. The guard moved closer. He pulled out a shock prod from his belt, the kind of weapon that delivered electrical charges meant to cause pain without permanent damage. It crackled with blue energy. Michael's heart was pounding. The debate continued in the background, some Krell representative discussing the economic implications of restricting resource acquisition from pre-warp worlds. Nobody was paying attention to what was happening on the chamber floor. The guard raised the shock prod and struck the mother across her back. She collapsed with a cry of pain, trying to curl around her daughter to protect her. The energy shackles kept her from moving freely, tangling her up as she fell. The little girl screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through Michael's chest like a knife. The guard barked another command. Silence. And the debate just kept going. Thousands of beings discussing philosophy and law while a child watched her mother get beaten 5 feet away from them. Michael stood up. He didn't decide to. Didn't think about it. His body just moved on its own like someone else was controlling it. Ambassador Reeves grabbed his arm. Michael, no. Don't. He pulled away from her and started down the steps toward the chamber floor. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Every diplomatic training session he'd ever attended was screaming at him to stop. Sit down, don't throw away everything Earth has worked for. Humans were already seen as too emotional, too impulsive, too controlled by their feelings instead of logic. This would confirm every prejudice the elder species had about humanity. He didn't care. His feet hit the crystal floor and he started walking toward the Talvek captives. A few delegates noticed him now, their attention drawn by the unusual sight of someone leaving their designated area during a formal session. The luminous thoughts crystals pulsed with what might have been confusion or irritation. The Vorn guard saw him coming. His compound eyes fixed on Michael, and his mandibles spread in what the translator rendered as amusement. Return to your seat, primitive. This does not concern your backward species. Michael kept walking. The Talvek mother was still on the ground, trembling from the electrical shock. Her daughter was crying harder now, reaching for her mother but unable to move because of the shackles connecting them to the other captives. I said return. The guard stepped forward, blocking Michael's path. He was huge up close, easily twice Michael's size, his exoskeleton covered in military enhancements that probably made him strong enough to snap Michael in half. Do not interfere with hierarchy property. They're not property, Michael heard himself say. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. They're people. More delegates were paying attention now. The debate was faltering as representatives noticed the confrontation on the floor. The Vorn commander stopped his presentation, his compound eyes focusing on Michael with the kind of predatory interest that made Michael's survival instincts scream at him to run. Honored Council, the commander said, his voice dripping with condescension, it appears the humans require education in basic protocol. Perhaps they are not yet ready to participate in civilized discourse. Laughter rippled through parts of the chamber. Not cruel laughter exactly. More like the indulgent chuckling adults give when a child says something naive. But it burned in Michael's chest anyway. He stepped around the guard and moved toward the Talvek family. The mother looked up at him with eyes full of fear and confusion, unsure if this new alien meant help or more danger. The guard grabbed Michael's shoulder and spun him around. Final warning, human. Michael shook off his grip and positioned himself directly between the guard and the Talvek mother and daughter. No. Just that. Just one word. But something in how he said it must have conveyed his absolute refusal to move, because the guard's mandibles clicked rapidly in what translated as anger. The shock prod came up, crackling with energy. The guard wasn't bluffing anymore. Ambassador Reeves was running down the steps now, calling Michael's name. The luminous thought was saying something about disrupted proceedings. The whole massive chamber was focused on this one moment. The guard swung the shock prod toward Michael in a motion meant to intimidate, to make him flinch back. But Michael saw the arc of the swing, saw where it was actually aimed. Not at him. At the little girl behind him. Michael lunged forward and caught the guard's arm. The shock prod discharged against Michael's shoulder instead, and pain exploded through his body like lightning made of knives. His muscles seized. His vision went white. He went down hard, his body convulsing, but he kept his grip on the guard's arm. He could hear shouting. Multiple voices. The chamber was chaos now. But Michael's world had narrowed to pure pain and the absolute certainty that he couldn't let go, couldn't let that weapon reach the child behind him. The guard threw him off easily. Michael hit the crystal floor and slid, his body still twitching from the electrical discharge. Through blurred vision, he saw the guard standing over him, raising the shock prod for another strike. This time aimed directly at Michael's head. He tried to move. Couldn't. His muscles wouldn't respond. The little girl's terrified face swam in his vision. Her mother was screaming something. And Michael felt something break inside him. Not his body. Something deeper. Something that had been holding back a lifetime of watching people with power hurt people without it. Every bully he'd seen. Every injustice he'd witnessed. Every time he'd been told to stay calm, to be reasonable, to not make waves. All of it came rushing up through his chest and out his mouth in a sound he didn't know he could make. Michael screamed. Raw and primal and full of pure rage. He screamed his defiance at cruelty. He screamed his refusal to accept this. He screamed for every being who'd ever been hurt while others looked away and debated the politics of intervention. The sound echoed off the ancient crystal walls, reverberating through the massive chamber with shocking intensity. And somewhere beneath him, the floor began to glow. He felt it like warm sunlight on his skin, even though he knew it was scanning him in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. The seal was reading him. Not just his physical body but something deeper. His history appeared in the air around him, and Michael watched his own life play out in compressed images and data streams. There was him as a kid, standing between a bully and a smaller student on the playground. A memory he'd almost forgotten. The seal highlighted it, marked it with symbols that pulsed with significance. Another scene from high school, where he'd given up his spot on the basketball team so a friend who needed the scholarship more could have it. The seal marked that too. His decision to go into diplomacy not because it paid well or offered prestige, but because he genuinely wanted to help build bridges between people who didn't understand each other. 100 small moments where he'd chosen compassion over convenience. Where he'd helped someone when nobody was watching. Where he'd stood up for what was right even though it cost him something. And then the seal showed what had just happened. Michael rushing down to the chamber floor. His decision to stand between the guard and the Talvek child. The moment he'd grabbed the shock prod, taking the hit himself to protect someone he didn't even know. And finally his scream. That raw, furious sound of someone who'd witnessed cruelty and refused to accept it. The rotating circles of the seal suddenly stopped. All its components locked into a new configuration with mathematical precision. The light surrounding Michael intensified until he had to close his eyes against the glare. He felt weight settle over him, not physical weight but something else. Responsibility maybe. Authority. The kind of burden you feel when someone hands you something precious and trusts you not to break it. A voice spoke. It didn't come from any direction. It just existed, suddenly in Michael's head and probably in everyone else's head too. Ancient beyond measure. Translated perfectly into every language known to every species in the chamber. Speaking directly into their minds with undeniable clarity. Air recognized. The words hung in the air. Michael opened his eyes and found thousands of beings staring at him. The Vorn commander's mandibles were frozen mid-click. Ambassador Reeves had one hand over her mouth. Dr. Hayes looked like someone had just proven that gravity worked backwards. The seal pulsed with light and more words came. Compassion protocol activated. Judgment may proceed. Michael stood frozen as the words echoed in his mind. Air recognized. Judgment may proceed. He had no idea what that meant, but the way every species in the chamber was staring at him suggested it was significant. The Vorn commander looked like he'd just watched his entire battle plan collapse. The luminous thoughts crystals were pulsing so rapidly they were almost vibrating. Ambassador Reeves found her voice first. What does that mean? Heir to what? The seal didn't answer her directly. Instead, it pulsed again and a new hologram began forming beside it. This one showed a being Michael had never seen before. Humanoid in basic shape but clearly not human. Taller, with features that seemed to shift between familiar and completely alien. Its eyes were the most striking thing about it. They held depths of emotion that Michael could feel even through a hologram that was millions of years old. Sadness. Hope. Compassion so deep it made his chest ache just looking at it. Precursor, Dr. Hayes whispered. That's an actual precursor. Nobody's ever seen one before. We found their buildings, their technology, but never any images of them. The holographic precursor began to speak, and like the seal's voice, the words formed directly in everyone's minds. If you are hearing this, then we are gone. Our civilization has ended as we always knew it would. But before we departed, we left gifts for those who would come after us. Michael realized he was holding his breath. Around the chamber, thousands of beings had gone completely silent. They were witnessing something impossible. A message from the species that had built half the ancient structures in the galaxy, the mysterious founders who'd vanished without explanation before most current civilizations had even evolved. New holograms bloomed around the chamber. Star systems. Planets. Michael recognized some of them. There was the Savanthi homeworld in its early stages. The crystalline structures where the Luminari had first formed. Dozens of worlds, all being visited by precursor ships that looked nothing like modern spacecraft. They were seeding life, Michael realized. Or guiding it. Helping species develop in specific directions. We gave each species gifts, the precursor continued. To the Savanthi we gave curiosity and the drive to understand. To the Formians we gave engineering minds that could build anything they could imagine. To the Luminari we gave philosophical depth and the ability to see patterns in chaos. Each gift was chosen carefully to help these species survive and eventually reach beyond their worlds. The hologram shifted to show Earth. Michael's heart jumped at the sight of his home planet, blue and green and beautiful, spinning slowly in space. But this was Earth from millions of years ago when humans were still figuring out how to use tools. But one world we made different, the precursor said. We called it the Compassion Reserve. A place where we would guide evolution down a unique path. Dr. Hayes was frantically taking notes again, but his hands were shaking. They're saying they influenced human evolution. That we're the result of deliberate intervention. The precursor's hologram seemed to look directly at Michael, even though it was a recording made long before he was born. We did not create humanity. We simply emphasized certain traits during your development. Traits that other species naturally evolve away from as they advance toward the stars. The hologram showed early humans in small groups. Michael watched them care for their sick, protect their children, share food with those who had none. Simple acts of compassion that probably happened every day. The precursor highlighted these moments, marked them as significant. Every intelligent species begins with compassion, the recording explained. It is necessary for survival. Groups that care for each other outlast groups that do not. But as civilizations grow, as they master their environments and reach for space, something changes. Emotion becomes inefficiency. Instinctive protection becomes illogical when you can calculate better outcomes. The drive to help the weak becomes a hindrance to progress. The luminous thought pulsed in what might have been recognition. The great optimization. Every species goes through it. The period where logic replaces emotion in decision-making. Exactly, the precursor said, as if responding to the interruption across millions of years. And it is necessary. Species cannot reach the stars on emotion alone. They need logic, calculation, the ability to make hard decisions without being paralyzed by feelings. But in optimizing themselves for space travel, they lose something precious. They forget how to care without calculating the cost first. Michael understood what the precursor was saying, and it made a horrible kind of sense. The elder species around him weren't cruel. They were just optimized. They'd evolved past the messy, inefficient emotions that made humans do stupid things like throw away their careers to protect a stranger's child. The hologram showed Earth's development continuing. Humans building civilizations, fighting wars, creating art, reaching for the stars. But unlike the other species, human compassion didn't get optimized away. It stayed raw and powerful and sometimes overwhelming. It made humans slower to reach space than they could have been. Made them waste resources on helping those who couldn't help themselves. Made them do illogical things for emotional reasons. We preserved humanity's emotional core, the precursor continued. We made sure your compassion would remain instinctive, impossible to ignore even when logic demanded otherwise. It made you chaotic, difficult, prone to conflict. But it meant you would never lose the ability to care deeply and act on that caring without hesitation. The view shifted to show the grand chamber itself during its construction. Precursors working on the intricate machinery that was now glowing all around them. The seal taking shape above, its purpose being carefully encoded into systems designed to last forever. This chamber is a test, the precursor explained. We knew that one day species from across the galaxy would gather here. We knew they would build a council to maintain order and peace. We knew they would be wise and logical and just by their own standards. And we knew they would have forgotten how to truly feel. A new display appeared showing the seal's activation requirements. Complex formulas that made Dr. Hayes gasp in recognition. But the core concept was simple enough that even Michael understood it. The seal activates only when someone demonstrates pure compassion at personal cost. Not calculated charity where you help because it benefits you later. Not logical altruism where you assist others because it maintains social order. But selfless protection offered without thought of consequence. The willingness to scream defiance at cruelty even when silence would be wiser. Michael felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. They'd been waiting for someone like him. For millions of years, this seal had been watching, waiting for someone to act on pure emotion instead of careful calculation. For millions of years we calculated no species would trigger it, the precursor said. The elder races would be too evolved past such raw emotion. The younger races would be too afraid of offending the elder races to act impulsively. We needed someone from a species that had reached the stars but had not yet optimized away their capacity for irrational compassio. The Vorn commander's voice cut through the chamber, sharp with anger. This is manipulation. The precursors engineered a situation to give authority to a species that by all logic should have none. Not authority, the precursor corrected gently. Judgment. There is a profound difference. We could not stay to guide you. We could not prevent the natural evolution that would make you wise but cold. But we could leave a reminder. A failsafe activated when most needed. The hologram expanded to fill the chamber's upper reaches. The precursor's face looked down at them all with an expression that mixed hope and sorrow in equal measure. Law without compassion is tyranny, the recording said. Order without empathy is cruelty. Advancement that does not protect the weak is simply barbarism dressed in civilization's clothing. We hoped you would remember this on your own. But if you forgot, we left you this reminder in the form of a species that cannot forget. A species that will scream at injustice even when it costs them everything. New symbols appeared around Michael, flowing from the seal like water. He felt their weight settling over him, granting him something he'd never asked for and didn't want. Authority over a council that had existed for millions of years. The power to override laws older than human civilization. The responsibility to judge matters that affected thousands of species. The heir may pass judgment on matters brought before this council, the precursor explained. The heir may override precedent when compassion demands it. The heir may reshape law when law has forgotten its purpose. This authority exists until relinquished or until another heir is recognized. Ambassador Reeves stepped closer to Michael, her voice barely a whisper. How long could this last? Until you leave the chamber? Until he chooses to give it up, the precursor answered. Or until humanity evolves past compassion as all species eventually do. Then the seal will seek another species that still remembers how to care more than they calculate. There will always be at least one, we hope. Evolution tends toward optimization, but the universe is vast and diverse. The hologram began to fade, the precursor's final words echoing through the chamber. We built this council to maintain peace across the stars. But we built this seal to maintain justice. Do not confuse one for the other. The heir will help you remember the difference. Trust and compassion even when logic argues against it. Especially then. The image vanished, leaving only the seal rotating slowly above them. Its light now centered entirely on Michael, waiting. The Talvek child tugged at her mother's chains and pointed at him with a small, furry hand. Kind one, she said in her own language, the chamber's systems translating instantly. The kind one will help us. Michael looked at her, at the hope in her large eyes, and felt the crushing weight of what was being asked of him. The precursors had spent millions of years setting this up. Had engineered humanity specifically for this purpose. Had waited through epochs for someone to care enough to throw away everything and scream at cruelty. He hadn't wanted any of this. Hadn't asked to be humanity's representative of compassion. He just wanted to stop a child from being hurt. But the seal was waiting. The council was watching. And the Talvek captives were still in chains. Michael took a shaky breath and looked up at the ancient machine that had somehow recognized him as the heir to an impossible legacy. His voice came out steadier than he felt. All right. Let's talk about what happens next. The Grand Chamber held its breath. 3,000 species waited to see what a human who'd been in space for less than 5 years would do with authority that predated most of their civilizations. Michael's hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists to hide it. His shoulders still throbbed where the shock prod had hit him, a constant reminder that this wasn't some dream he could wake up from. This was real. The seal was real. The power it offered him was real. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with it. "I don't want this," he said, his voice carrying through the massive chamber with a clarity that surprised him. Maybe the chamber's acoustics were helping. Maybe the seal was amplifying his words. Either way, thousands of beings heard him. "I'm not qualified to judge anyone. 6 months ago I was filing paperwork and trying to remember which species finds eye contact offensive. I barely know how galactic law works." The Vorn commander's mandibles clicked with what might have been relief. Then the human admits his inadequacy. Remove him and this absurdity can end. "I didn't say I wouldn't do it," Michael continued, and his voice was stronger now. "I said I'm not qualified. There's a difference. I'm not smart enough or experienced enough to understand all the complicated legal stuff you've built up over millions of years. But I don't need to be. Because the problem right in front of me isn't complicated at all." He gestured toward the Talvek captives, still huddled in their energy shackles. The little girl was watching him with eyes that held too much hope. It made Michael's chest tight. Those people are in chains. That child was about to be beaten for crying. And every single one of you just sat there debating legal technicalities while it happened right in front of you. That's not wisdom. That's not logic. That's just convenient cruelty with fancy words wrapped around it. The luminous thought pulsed, its crystalline form shifting colors. The law exists to prevent chaos. Without clear rules and precedents, stronger species would constantly interfere with weaker ones. They would impose their values, disrupt natural development, create endless conflict. The prime directive that prevents intervention with pre-warp species has maintained peace for millions of years. Peace for who? Michael asked. The question hung in the air. For you? For the species strong enough to have seats at this council? What about species like the Talvek? Does your peace help them when they're being enslaved? Or does your peace just mean you get to ignore what happens to people who aren't strong enough to fight back? A Savanthi scholar raised herself higher on her coiled body. You oversimplify complex issues. If we intervene in every conflict, if we protect every pre-warp species from every threat, we become tyrants ourselves. We impose our will across the galaxy based on our moral judgments. That is not peace. That is dominion. Michael felt his anger rising again, but this time he tried to channel it into something useful instead of just screaming. You're right. It is complicated. Figuring out when to intervene and when to let species develop naturally. That's really hard. But enslaving people isn't natural development. It's not some cultural quirk that we should respect. It's just powerful people hurting weaker ones because they can. Dr. Hayes spoke up from the human section, his academic tone cutting through the tension in a way that somehow helped. The precursor's message was explicit. You've optimized past the ability to recognize certain kinds of injustice. You've created legal frameworks that let you ignore suffering because acknowledging it would require action, and action is messy and complicated. That's not superior evolution. That's just a really sophisticated way of not caring. Ambassador Reeves moved to stand beside Michael. He expected her to try to soften his words, to translate his anger into diplomatic language that wouldn't offend anyone. Instead, she surprised him for the second time that day. He's right, she said firmly. I've spent 15 years working within your system, following your protocols, trying to prove that humanity deserves a seat here. But if having that seat means staying silent while we watch injustice happen, if it means calculating the political cost before we're allowed to care about suffering, then what's the point? What kind of council is this if compassion is treated as a weakness instead of a strength? The seal pulsed brighter, responding to something in her words. Michael felt the weight of authority pressing down harder on his shoulders. The precursor technology was waiting for him to use it, to demonstrate that humanity's inability to ignore suffering was exactly what the galaxy needed. Taking a deep breath, Michael looked up at the rotating seal and made his decision. I'm passing judgment. The Talvek captives will be freed. Right now. No negotiations, no debates, no legal process. The Vorn will release them and provide transportation back to their homeworld. Red warning symbols blazed around the Vorn delegation. The seal had shifted from observer to enforcer, and Michael could feel the power it was offering him. Ancient weapon systems coming online. Force fields that could immobilize anyone he designated. The technology to enforce his judgment with overwhelming power. Would be so easy. Point at the Vorn and let the chamber's defenses handle everything. Make them pay for what they'd done. Show them what happened when you hurt people in front of someone who'd been chosen specifically because they couldn't ignore suffering. But something made Michael pause. A memory of the precursor's words about law versus justice. About compassion not being the same as revenge. But that's not enough, he said, surprising himself. Freeing these 20 people doesn't fix anything. It doesn't help the next species that gets conquered. It doesn't change the system that made this possible in the first place. He could feel the entire chamber's attention focused on him now. This was the moment. The real judgment. Not just about the Talvek standing in front of him, but about how the council itself operated. So here's what I'm proposing. A new law. I'm calling it the Compassion Mandate. The words appeared in glowing symbols above the assembly, translated instantly into every language. Michael saw delegates reacting with shock, confusion, some with what looked like interest. The Compassion Mandate says that sapient beings have rights regardless of their technology level. The Prime Directive can still prevent us from interfering with cultural development. We don't go around forcing primitive species to adopt our values or our technology. But slavery isn't culture. Genocide isn't tradition. Systematic cruelty isn't something we have to respect just because a species hasn't invented warp drive yet. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted objections in 100 different languages. The translation system struggled to keep up with everyone talking at once. The Formians argued about legal precedent. The Krell protested about enforcement complications. Multiple species were demanding votes and procedures and committee reviews. The Luminous Thought's voice managed to cut through the chaos. You propose overturning millions of years of carefully constructed law. The instability this could create. The conflicts it could spark. Have you considered the consequences? I've considered that your current law lets you sleep at night while people suffer, Michael shot back. I've considered that you've built a system where compassion is treated like a bug instead of a feature. Yeah, this will be complicated. Yeah, there will be disputes about what counts as cruelty versus cultural differences. But at least you'll be having those conversations instead of hiding behind precedent. A Savanthi delegate raised an objection that Michael had been expecting. The seal grants you authority in this chamber. It does not grant you authority over council law itself. We could simply refuse to enforce your mandate once you leave. The seal pulsed and that ancient voice returned. Brief. Absolute. Final. Air authority extends to matters of fundamental justice. Compassion mandate encoded in chamber protocols. Enforcement guaranteed. Michael felt the power surge through the ancient systems all around him. His mandate was being written into the chamber's very foundation, becoming as permanent as the walls themselves. The seal wasn't giving him temporary authority. It was changing the rules permanently, making compassion a required part of how the council operated. The Vorn commander's mandibles clacked in fury. This is tyranny. You impose human values on species millions of years older. Compassion isn't a human value, Dr. Hayes called out. The precursors said it themselves. Every species starts with it. Humans just haven't optimized it away yet. Michael turned to face the Vorn delegation directly. The commander looked like he wanted to attack, but the red warning symbols around him pulsed dangerously, reminding everyone that the chamber's ancient defenses were active and ready. Release them, Michael said quietly. Please. You can argue about the law later. Right now just let those people go. For a long moment the commander didn't move. Michael could see the calculation happening behind those compound eyes. The military assessment of whether fighting was worth it. The political consideration of what defying the seal might cost. The simple rage at being forced to back down by a species the Vorn considered primitive. Finally, the commander made a sharp gesture. The guards deactivated the energy shackles with clear reluctance. The Talvek stumbled forward, suddenly free after who knows how long in captivity. Some of them collapsed. Others caught each other. The mother pulled her daughter close, both of them shaking with relief. Michael moved toward them without thinking. The mother looked up at him with eyes full of tears and said something rapid in her own language. The translation came through fragmented, but Michael understood the meaning well enough. Thank you. You saved us. How can we ever repay you? You don't need to repay anything, Michael told her. You just need to get home safe. The council will help with that. The luminous thought pulsed with resignation. The human has passed judgment. The Vorn hierarchy will provide transportation for the Talvek to their homeworld. Additionally, the hierarchy will face sanctions under the new Compassion Mandate. Suspension from council trade agreements until they demonstrate compliance with sapient rights standards. The Vorn delegation turned and moved toward the exit, their military precision barely hiding their fury. At the doors, the commander stopped and looked back at Michael. You have made a powerful enemy today, human? I know, Michael said. But I'd rather have powerful enemies than become someone who looks away when people need help. As the Vorn left, the tension in the chamber began to shift. The immediate crisis was over, but Michael could feel the larger implications settling over everyone. The compassion mandate was now part of council law. The seal would enforce it. And humanity, the newest and weakest member of the council, had just fundamentally changed how galactic governance worked. Some delegates looked angry. Others thoughtful. A few even seemed relieved, as if they'd been waiting for someone to say what Michael had said but couldn't bring themselves to do it. The seal continued rotating above them, its light dimming but not disappearing completely. It had fulfilled its purpose for now, but Michael could feel it watching. Waiting. Ready to activate again if the council forgot this lesson. Ready to find another heir if humanity somehow evolved past caring. The Talvek child approached Michael shyly. She held out her small hand in what seemed to be a gesture of gratitude in her culture. Michael knelt down so they were at eye level and gently placed his hand over hers. "You screamed for us," she said through the translation systems. "When no one else would. We will remember you. My people will always remember the human who screamed." Michael felt his throat get tight. He'd thrown away his career. Possibly damaged Earth standing with half the galaxy. Created enemies among species that could crack planets if they wanted to. All for 20 people he'd never met before and would probably never see again after today. And he'd do it again in a heartbeat. As council officials began organizing care for the Talvek and transport arrangements, Ambassador Reeves stood beside Michael, both of them watching the ancient seal slowly dim back to dormancy. "Earth's government is going to have so many questions," she said quietly. "I know. The precursors designed humanity to be the galactic conscience. To be the species that screams at injustice when everyone else has optimized past caring. That's a lot of pressure." "I know," Michael said again. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. "But you did good today. You stood up when it mattered. That's what being human is supposed to mean." Michael looked at the Talvek being led to safety. At the seal dormant but watching above. At 3,000 species processing the fact that their ancient laws had just been rewritten by someone who joined the council 5 years ago. He thought about going home and trying to explain all this to people back on Earth. About how humanity had apparently been engineered millions of years ago to serve as a reminder that compassion mattered. About how his impulsive decision to protect one scared child had activated ancient technology and changed galactic law. It was insane. Overwhelming. Terrifying. But looking at the Talvek child's grateful smile, Michael thought maybe the precursors had been right. Maybe the galaxy did need someone who would scream at cruelty without calculating the cost first. Someone who would choose compassion over politics every single time, even when it was stupid and reckless and threw away everything. The seal pulsed one final time as if acknowledging his thoughts. Then it went fully dormant, settling in to watch and wait. But Michael knew it wasn't really sleeping. It was just patient. Waiting for the next time someone needed to be reminded that wisdom without compassion was just sophisticated cruelty. And when that time came, whether it was Michael or another human or eventually some other species entirely, someone would stand up and scream. Because that's what the air did. That's what compassion demanded. That's what it meant to be human.